The morning they told Clara Bennett she was no longer welcome in the house she had kept for 11 years. She was standing at the stove making breakfast for the family that was about to throw her away. Harriet Bennett walked into that kitchen, set a sealed letter on the counter without a word, and walked back out. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, picked up the letter, and read it standing up. Then she set it back down, turned the bacon in the pan, and finished making breakfast. Because the food would burn if she didn't, and she was not going to give them a burnt kitchen to remember her by. If this is your first time finding our channel, welcome, and please subscribe before this story pulls you any further in, because what happens to Clara on the other end of that wagon road is something that will stay with you. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Now stay with us, because it travels far. Clara Bennett had been erased so slowly, she almost didn't notice it happening. Not all at once. Not with a single declaration or a slammed door. It was done the way you starve something quietly, methodically, with just enough left to keep it from dying too fast. First, they stopped using her name at the dinner table. Then they stopped consulting her about household decisions she'd been making for a decade. Then Gerald Bennett, her brother-in-law, began speaking about her in the third person, even when she was sitting in the same room. "She'll need to be told about the east fence repair," he said one evening in March, looking at his wife across the table with Clara 3 feet away pouring coffee. His wife Nora glanced at Clara and then back at Gerald. "I'll tell her." Clara set the coffee pot down. "I'm right here, Gerald." He picked up his fork. "I know where you are." That was March. Robert died in April. By May, Clara had been moved out of the bedroom she'd shared with her husband for 11 years and into the room off the back hall that used to store winter quilts. She understood what the room meant. She understood it the way you understand weather, not because someone explains it to you, but because you've lived long enough to read the signs. The quilt room meant temporary. The quilt room meant they were deciding what to do with her, and whatever they decided, it wasn't going to involve her staying. She was right. She heard them talking about it on a Tuesday evening in June, their voices carrying through the thin plank wall with the easy confidence of people who've stopped worrying about being overheard. "She has no people of her own," Harriet said. "No money, no children, nothing that would make keeping her practical." "She's not our responsibility," Gerald said. "She never was. Robert married her against our advice, and we made the best of it while he was alive. He's gone now. People will talk if we simply put her out." "I'm not putting her out. I'm finding her a situation." The word landed with the flat authority of a man who'd already made the decision and was now managing the announcement. "There's a rancher out past Copper Ridge, Callahan, Wyatt Callahan. 600 acres, runs it mostly alone since his wife passed. He's been needing domestic help for months. I'll write him a letter." A pause. The sound of a chair scraping. "And if he won't take her, he'll take her. Men like that always need someone to manage the house. I'll frame it as doing him a favor." Clara stood on the other side of that wall with both hands flat against the plaster and her eyes open in the dark. She was not crying. She'd used up her tears in April, sitting beside Robert's body in the ranch infirmary, while the doctor told her things she already knew. She had no more tears for this. What she had instead was something harder and less comfortable. A cold, clarifying anger that she had learned over 11 years in this house to keep very still and very quiet. She went back to the quilt room. She sat on the edge of the cot. She thought for exactly 2 minutes about what her options were. Then she got up and started packing, because if they were going to send her somewhere, she was going to arrive with her things in order and her spine straight, and they were not going to watch her cry about it. She packed the good dress first, then the work dresses, then the small things that mattered: Robert's wooden anniversary box, the photograph from their wedding day, the book of household accounts she'd kept for 11 years in her own handwriting, every page of it, because that record was hers, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Gerald came to tell her the next morning, wearing the careful face of a man delivering news. "He's rehearsed." He stood in the doorway of the quilt room and explained the situation with the particular generosity of someone who's decided they're being more than fair. Clara let him finish. Then she said, "When does the wagon leave?" Gerald blinked. He'd clearly expected something else. Tears maybe. A protest. Something he could decline. "Friday," he said. Pete will drive you. Fine. She turned back to her suitcase. I'll be ready. He stood there for another moment, slightly off balance, and then he left. Clara listened to his footsteps go down the hall and thought about the fact that in 11 years he had never once called her by her given name. She decided that was the last rent-free space he would ever occupy in her mind. Friday came. Pete, the youngest ranch hand, loaded her single suitcase with the careful embarrassment of a boy doing something he knew was wrong, but hadn't figured out how to refuse. He didn't look at her directly. Clara climbed onto the wagon seat without help, arranged her skirt, and looked straight ahead. Harriet did not come out to see her off. The wheels turned. The Bennett property shrank behind her. The Montana sky opened up enormous and indifferent and strangely clean, the way sky always looks when you've been living too long inside walls that belong to other people. "You all right, ma'am?" Pete said after the first mile. "I'm fine," Clara said. I'm sorry about all this." "Don't be sorry, Pete. You didn't do anything." He was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Callahan's a decent man," he said. "Quiet, but decent." "Good," Clara said. "They say he's been alone out there since his wife passed. That was maybe 8 years ago. Ranch got run down for a spell, but he pulled it back himself." Pete adjusted his hat against the sun. "He doesn't say much, but he's fair. Never known him to treat anybody badly." Clara looked at the road. "How far?" 2 hours. Maybe a little more." She nodded and said nothing else, and Pete, who was 22 and had not yet learned how to sit comfortably in silence beside a woman who clearly needed none of his comfort, spent the rest of the drive watching the horizon. They arrived at Callahan's ranch in the hard heat of mid-afternoon. The yard was orderly. Clara noticed that first, not a decorated kind of order, but a working one. The order of a person who knows that chaos costs time and time out here costs everything. Fences solid, tools put away, the water trough positioned to catch roof runoff. A man who thought ahead. She noted that and filed it. Wyatt Callahan came around the side of the barn and stopped when he saw the wagon. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, built like a man who'd been doing hard physical work since before he was grown, with a face that had been weathered into something that had more honesty than beauty, but wasn't without either. He walked toward them without hurrying, and Clara watched him move and thought, this is a man who doesn't waste himself. He looked at Pete, then at Clara, then at the suitcase. "This the Bennett woman," he said to Pete. "Yes, sir." His eyes moved to Clara then, and she met them directly. He wasn't doing what men usually did, scanning her size, making the fast assessment, filing her in the category they'd already prepared. He looked at her face, like he was actually trying to read something there. "Mr. Callahan," she said. She kept her voice even. She had made a decision on that wagon. She was not beginning this, whatever it was, from a position of apology. He touched the brim of his hat. Once, brief. "Ma'am? I understand you were told to expect me." "Got a letter from Gerald Bennett 2 weeks ago." His voice was flat without being cold. "It said you'd be coming. Didn't say much beyond that." "No," Clara said. "I wouldn't expect it did." Something moved across his face. Not softness, but a recalibration, like he'd been prepared for one thing, and she'd turned out to be something else. "You hungry?" "I could eat. Kitchen's through there." He nodded toward the house. "Bread from this morning and cold meat. Help yourself." He looked at Pete. "You staying the night?" "No, sir. I need to get back before dark." "Water your horse before you go." He turned and walked back toward the barn. Pete looked at Clara with an expression that mixed sympathy and relief in roughly equal measure. Clara picked up her suitcase and walked to the house. Inside she found the kitchen. Bread, cold meat, a pitcher of water. She sat at the long table and ate with the deliberate attention of someone who understands that food is fuel, and she was going to need fuel. She didn't look around the room cataloging it. She ate. She thought. She listened to the particular quality of silence in the house and thought, this is a place that got used to one person a long time ago. Wyatt came in while she was finishing. He went to the wash basin and scrubbed his hands with the brisk efficiency of a man who does it 50 times a day. Then he dried his hands and turned around. "There's a room off the back," he said. "Small, private. You can put your things there." "Thank you." 8 ranch hands. Breakfast at 5:30, supper at 6. Dinner they managed themselves out at the bunkhouse. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, and she noticed he did it without the territorial claim. Most men make with a chair in their own kitchen. Careful, deliberate, like he was making room rather than taking it. If you're going to be working the kitchen, that's your frame. "What else would I be doing?" Clara said. "Keeping the house, mending, whatever comes up." He looked at her directly. "I want to say something plain, and I'd rather say it now than later." "Go ahead." "I don't know what Gerald told you about this arrangement, but I'm not running a charity, and I'm not running a prison. You want to work, I'll pay you for the work. Same rate I'd pay anybody." He held her gaze. "You decide this isn't where you want to be, I won't stop you. That clear?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. This was not the speech she'd expected. She'd expected management, the careful generosity of a man who'd agreed to take on a problem and wanted her to understand the terms of the transaction. This was different. This was a man drawing a line that protected her, not him. "That's clear," she said, "and I'll say something plain in return." He waited. "I'm not here to be a problem that gets managed. I came because I didn't have another option, but that's not how I intend to operate." She held his gaze. "I'll work hard. I'll keep a clean house, and I won't make your life more difficult than it already is. What I won't do is be grateful for things I've earned or apologize for taking up space." She paused. "Is that clear?" The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "Perfectly," Wyatt said. And something in his face just barely, just for a moment, shifted into what might on a different face have been the beginning of a smile. He stood, picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "The name's Wyatt. You don't need Mr. Callahan." "Clara," she said. He nodded, touched the brim, left. She sat alone in the kitchen and listened to him go, and thought that this might not be the disaster they'd intended it to be. The first morning proved her instincts right. She was up at 4:15. By 4:40, she'd made a full survey of the kitchen, what was there, what wasn't, what had been put where for no discernible reason, versus where it actually needed to be. The pantry was the organized chaos of a man who cooked out of necessity rather than method. The cast iron was good, which mattered. The knife was sharp, which mattered more. By 5:20, she had biscuits in the oven, coffee on the stove, oatmeal on the back burner, and bacon laid out, waiting for the heat. The first hand through the door was Billy, 19 years old, who walked in with his head down and stopped dead when the smell hit him. He looked up, saw Clara, looked at the stove, looked back at Clara. "Ma'am," he said. Mr. Callahan didn't mention." "Sit down," Clara said. "Coffee's ready." He sat. 3 more came in behind him, then 2 at once. Then old Hector, who was the last through the door and who stopped inside the threshold and stood very still for a moment, with his eyes closed, breathing in the smell of proper breakfast, like a man remembering something good. He opened his eyes, looked at Clara. "You make those biscuits?" he said. "I did." He sat down, took one, bit into it, chewed slowly, and with the concentrated attention of a man conducting a serious evaluation. "Good biscuits," he said finally, with the gravity of a judge delivering a verdict. "Thank you, Hector." He looked up sharply. "You know my name. Pete told me about the crew on the way out. You're Hector, 20 years on this ranch. Tom is the one with the red kerchief. Billy is the youngest, and Jimmy has the bad knee from the '83 fence accident." She poured coffee down the line without spilling a drop. "I find it useful to know who I'm feeding." Hector looked at her for a long moment. Then he went back to his biscuit, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Like a door that had been latched opening an inch, Wyatt came in last. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the full table, the food the 8 men eating with the particular focus of people who'd been handed something better than expected. His eyes moved to Clara. She was already at the stove, not looking at him, pulling the last of the biscuits out of the cast iron. He sat down. "I'll need to send someone to town for supplies before tomorrow," Clara said, still not looking up. You're nearly out of salt pork cornmeal's low, and your baking soda is old enough that it won't do the work anymore. I'll have Pete's go this afternoon, Wyatt said. I'll write him a list. All right. She set the biscuit pan on the table. Tom reached for one immediately, then caught himself and looked at Wyatt. Wyatt nodded once. Tom took 3. Clara permitted herself a very small private satisfaction and went back to the stove. She did not ask for approval that first week. She did not watch faces to see if she was landing right or adjust her cooking to what she imagined they wanted or make herself agreeable in the particular exhausting way she'd spent 11 years being agreeable in a house where it was never quite enough. She cooked what needed cooking, kept what needed keeping, and observed. What she observed Tom was territorial about his tools and needed to be asked rather than told. Billy was eager and anxious and made mistakes when he felt watched. Jimmy's knee bothered him most in the mornings, and he moved better by mid-afternoon, but would never say so. Old Hector came to the kitchen 20 minutes before supper every evening, ostensibly to check if anything needed doing actually, because he was lonely in the particular contained way of a man who'd spent too many years managing his own company. She fed Hector before supper on the 3rd evening. Just a plate set quietly at the end of the table while she was finishing the cooking. He didn't comment on it. Neither did she. He ate it with the careful unhurriedness of a man who was trying to make something last. That was the beginning of her standing with the crew. Not a speech, not a gesture. A plate of food set in front of a man who needed it before he had to ask. It was the end of the 2nd week when the first real friction happened. She'd been reorganizing the pantry with Wyatt's knowledge. She'd told him plainly what she was doing and why when Tom came looking for the liniment oil he kept on the 3rd shelf. She'd moved it. She'd moved it to the supply room where it made more sense because liniment had no business being on a food shelf, regardless of how long it had been there. He came into the kitchen door and said, "Where's the liniment?" "Supply room left of the door 2nd shelf," Clara said without turning around. Tom didn't move. "I keep it in the pantry." "I know, I moved it." A pause. "That pantry is set up the way Mr. Callahan wants it." Clara came down from the step stool, turned around, looked at Tom with the calm of a woman who had dealt with louder and less reasonable men than this. "Tom, the liniment was next to the cinnamon. The cinnamon was next to the lard. You want to explain to me how that made sense. I want to explain to you that this ain't your pantry to rearrange. And yet someone needs to." She held his gaze. Supply room, 2nd shelf, left of the door. She turned back to the step stool. Tom stood there for another moment, and she could feel him deciding whether this was worth pushing. He was not a bad man, she'd already figured that out. He was a man who didn't like change, and who'd been the one to find things in the old system for long enough that the new system felt like a theft. "I'll tell Mr. Callahan," he said. "You're welcome to," Clara said. He left. She heard him in the yard 20 minutes later, talking to Wyatt. The words not carrying, but the tone of complaint absolutely clear. She kept working. Wyatt came to the pantry door 10 minutes after that. He looked at the reorganized shelves. He looked at the list she'd put on the inside of the pantry door, contents, quantities, what was running low. "Tom's put out about the liniment," he said. "I know." "You moved it to the supply room?" "Yes." He looked at the 3rd shelf where the liniment used to be. Looked at the cinnamon and the lard sitting in their now sensible arrangement. "Makes more sense over there," he said. "That's why I put it there." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'll talk to Tom," Wyatt said. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. He hadn't done it as a favor. He'd done it because it was the right call, and he was smart enough to see it. She respected that distinction, and she thought from the way he left without waiting for gratitude that he probably understood she did. Tom came to her that evening before supper, stood in the kitchen door with his hat in his hand, and the look of a man who'd been told something he already half knew. "Supply room makes sense," he said, "for the liniment." "It does," Clara said. "I shouldn't have talked to you the way I did." She looked at him for a moment. He was maybe 50, with hands that had been working hard since childhood, and a face that knew how to hold its shape when it was embarrassed. She thought about how much that had just cost him to say. "Forget it," she said. You want to tell me where else I'm likely to step wrong before I step there? Tom blinked. Then something in his face loosened. Well, he said slowly, Jimmy's real particular about the saddle soap. That's probably the next thing. I'll leave the saddle soap alone, she said. And Hector, he doesn't eat eggs. Never has. Makes him sick. Clara looked at him steadily. I know about Hector's eggs. Tom looked at the pan on the stove, looked at Clara. You already? 3 days ago. I was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. Then he put his hat back on and nodded once with the slow respect of a man who's figured out he's been working next to someone sharper than he initially measured. Yes, ma'am, he said, and went out. Hector, at the end of the table that evening, ate the plate she'd made without egg in it and said nothing. But after supper, when the others had gone, he sat in his usual spot with the bridle he'd been fixing for a week and said without looking up, He's a good man, Wyatt. Clara was washing the dishes. I know. Hasn't been an easy 8 years. I expect not. Hector rubbed at the leather. He doesn't let people close generally, but He stopped. Started again. He watches people. He watches how they do things, how they treat others. Took me a whole year before he started trusting me with anything that mattered. He paused. Been less than 3 weeks with you. Clara kept washing. What does that mean? Means he trusts what he sees, Hector said simply. And he's seeing something. She didn't respond to that. But she thought about it later in the small room off the back of the house, lying on the cot, with the summer dark pressing warm against the window. She thought about what it meant that a man like Wyatt Callahan, a man who'd lost the person he built everything with and spent 8 years learning to live inside the loss, was watching her with the careful attention of someone who wasn't sure yet if what he was seeing was real. And she thought about the fact that she was starting to watch him back. Not in the way she'd made herself watch people in the Bennett house cataloging danger and reading exits. This was different. This was the involuntary kind of watching, the kind where you notice someone across the yard before you've decided to look, where you hear their boot on the step and your body orients toward the sound before your mind catches up. She was not going to be foolish about this. She had been placed here against her will in a man's house, dependent on his goodwill and his decency, and she had no intention of turning that situation into something sentimental before she'd had time to understand what it actually was. But she noticed. She noticed the way he was with the horses, the specific, undemonstrative gentleness of a man who'd learned that trust isn't demanded, it's built. The way he listened when the hands talked to him fully, without the distracted half-attention of a man already composing his answer. The way he sat at the head of that table every morning and evening, and ran his eyes down the length of it like he was taking attendance, making sure everyone was there and accounted for. He ran a tight operation. But it wasn't the tightness of control. It was the tightness of care. The 3rd week brought the horse. Cinders was a young mare in the south pasture who'd found wire somewhere in the fence line and come back with a gash along her left flank that needed immediate cleaning and treatment. The problem was that Cinders had always been high-strung, and pain had made her worse. Wyatt had been trying to work with her for 20 minutes by the time Clara came out to the pasture to bring down the washing she'd hung on the line that morning. She heard the mare before she saw the situation, the hard breathing, the hooves on dry ground, the particular sound of an animal working itself up. She came around the fence corner and saw Wyatt trying to hold position with a horse that was throwing her head every time he got close with the cloth. Clara watched for a moment. Then she came through the gate. You want help? She said. Wyatt glanced at her. He was sweating, and there was a scrape across the back of his hand where Cinders had connected with something. You've worked horses before. Not much, but I've worked frightened animals. She moved to the mare's other side, keeping her body angled away, not submissive, not challenging, just present at the edge of the horse's awareness. And she started talking. Not to the horse specifically. Not in the cooing, theatrical way she'd seen some people do, that animals generally recognized as performance. She just talked low, even about nothing in particular. The heat of the afternoon. The way the field smelled after 3 dry weeks. The fact that the biscuits this morning had come out slightly better than yesterday's because she'd let the dough rest longer. Cinder's breathing changed. Her head came down. Not all the way, but enough. Wyatt worked fast and quiet, cleaning the gash, treating it properly, getting the bandage on while the window was open. When he stepped back, the mare was still agitated but manageable. The particular difference between a frightened animal and a frightened animal that believes, however tentatively, that the people around it are not going to make things worse. He looked at Clara across the horse's back. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. "I didn't learn it anywhere. I made it up when I was small." She kept her hand moving slowly along the mare's neck. "I had a dog that was afraid of everything. Thunderstorms, strangers, sudden movement. I figured out that if I just kept talking to him, it helped. Didn't matter what I said, just the sound." "Animals can't understand the words," Wyatt said. "No, but they can tell the difference between a voice that's scared and a voice that isn't." She looked at Cinders. "She didn't need to know what I was saying. She needed to know I wasn't panicking." Wyatt cleaned his hands on the cloth. He was looking at her with that reading expression she'd identified in the first 5 minutes of knowing him. Like there was a text, and he was working through it. "Does that work on people?" he said. "The talking, sometimes." She moved away from the mare slowly, not turning her back until she was at a safe distance. "People are harder. Animals at least have the sense to calm down when the threat is actually gone." She glanced at him. "People keep working themselves up long after there's nothing left to be afraid of." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "They do." He picked up his hat from the fence post and set it back on. "Thank you," he said, and he said it plainly without the self-conscious inflation men sometimes put around gratitude to make it sound more like a transaction. "You're welcome," Clara said. She picked up the washing from the fence line and walked back toward the house, and she did not let herself look back to see if he watched her go. She started leaving coffee on the stove for him that week. She'd noticed his pattern, always the last inside, always a few minutes spent at the kitchen window before going to his room, always the look of a man transitioning from one form of exhaustion to another. She said nothing about it. She just made sure the coffee was there. The first night he came in and found it, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the stove. Clara was still at the table mending Billy's shirt. She didn't look up. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I was still up." He poured a cup, stood at the window. The night outside was enormous and very dark and very still. Clara kept her needle moving. After a while he said, "You sleep all right here?" "Better than I expected." "It's quiet out this far. Some people find it hard. I find it restful." She finished a seam, checked it, turned the shirt over. 11 years in a house full of people who didn't want me there. Quiet is not something I'm inclined to complain about. He was quiet himself for a moment. Then, "The men have settled, since you came." "People do that when someone's paying attention to them," Clara said. "Is that what you're doing? Paying attention?" She looked up at him then. He was standing with his cup in both hands, the way a man stands when he's not sure what to do with his hands, and the lamplight made the tired lines of his face look less like wear and more like history. "It's the most useful thing I know how to do," she said. "Notice what people actually need, not what they say they need." He looked at her for a moment that lasted a beat longer than a casual one. Then he set the empty cup in the basin. "Good night, Clara." "Good night," she said. His boots crossed the floor. His door closed. Clara set down the shirt and looked at the lamp for a long moment, not thinking anything organized, just letting the day settle around her like sediment in water. She had been sent here as a punishment. She had been delivered like freight addressed to a stranger by people who believed that putting her somewhere inconvenient was the same as being rid of her. But sitting in this kitchen, in this house, in the particular deep quiet of the Montana summer dark, she thought about what Hector had said. He trusts what he sees, and he's seeing something. She thought about what she herself was beginning to see. She blew out the lamp, walked to her room, lay down on the cot, and pulled the thin summer blanket up and listened to the silence of the ranch at rest. The horses shifting in the barn, the distant sound of the creek, the rhythmic creak of the bunkhouse settling. They thought they were punishing her. They thought they were sending her somewhere to disappear. Clara stared at the ceiling in the dark, and for the first time in longer than she could name, something that was not quite hope, but was directly adjacent to it, settled in her chest like a coal that had just found air. She closed her eyes. 5:30 came early. She intended to be ready. 5:30 came and went, and the ranch kept moving. That was the thing about a working operation. It didn't pause to assess itself. The cattle needed feeding, the fences needed checking, the equipment needed maintaining, and the men needed feeding 3 times a day, whether the cook was still finding her footing or not. Clara understood this. She'd understood it from the first morning. So she stopped finding her footing and simply stood. By the end of the 4th week, she had the household running with a precision that the Callahan Ranch hadn't seen in years. Not a showy precision, nothing that announced itself or demanded acknowledgement. The kind that you only notice when it's gone, when suddenly the coffee isn't ready, and the mended shirt isn't on the hook, and the ache in your knee goes unaccounted for, because nobody thought to put the liniment where you could reach it without asking. But something else was happening too, underneath the daily work, quieter and more complicated. Something that Clara had not planned for and was not entirely sure how to handle. She was beginning to matter to these people. Not as a function. Not as the woman who cooked and mended and kept the pantry straight. As a person. As Clara. And that was territory she hadn't navigated in so long she'd half forgotten the geography of it. It started with Billy. He'd been avoiding her eyes since the first week, not from hostility she'd recognized early on, but from the particular shyness of a young man who has been raised to treat women with consideration, and isn't sure what consideration looks like when the woman in question is competent and unsentimental and doesn't seem to need anything from him. He'd brought her the wildflowers. He'd fled before she could respond. She'd let it go because pushing Billy would only make him smaller, and he needed to grow into the space at his own pace. It was a Thursday afternoon pie day, which had achieved the status of a minor institution when he finally came to her directly. She was at the kitchen table rolling out the second crust, when Billy appeared in the doorway with his hat in both hands and the expression of a man about to say something he'd rehearsed 3 times and still wasn't sure about. "Ma'am," he said, "can I ask you something?" "You can," Clara said without stopping the rolling. It's about a letter." He turned the hat in his hands. "I got a girl, back in Billings. We've been writing since February, but I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not good at the writing part. She writes me these long letters real proper, and what I write back sounds like a feed order." Clara looked up at him. He was 20 years old and in love and terrified of it in the way only the young can be terrified of something that isn't actually dangerous. "Do you want me to help you write back to her?" "I don't want you to write it for me," he said quickly. "That wouldn't be right. I thought maybe you could tell me what's wrong with what I've got." He held out a folded piece of paper with the careful caution of a man handing over something that could embarrass him. Clara wiped her hands, took it, and read it. It was exactly what he'd said. Functional earnest, completely devoid of the warmth she could see he actually felt. The boy could not get himself onto the page. "Sit down, Billy," she said. He sat. "You see this line?" She put her finger on the 3rd sentence. "You wrote, 'The weather has been dry and the cattle are doing well.' Do you actually care about the weather and the cattle when you're writing to her?" He looked pained. "No, ma'am." "Then why are you writing about them?" "Because I don't know what else to say." "Yes, you do. You're just afraid to say it." She handed the paper back. "Write to her the way you talked to me just now. Say exactly that you got her letter and reading it made you feel like a man trying to answer a song with a list. That's the truth. She'll love you for the truth." Billy stared at the paper. "What if she thinks I'm—" He stopped. "Thinks you're what?" "Not enough," he said quietly. Clara looked at him for a moment. 20 years old and already carrying the weight of that particular fear. She thought about 11 years of carrying it herself. She thought about Wyatt saying nothing across a table, but meaning it anyway. "Billy," she said, "a woman who takes the time to write you long, proper letters is not looking for someone enough. She's looking for someone real." She picked up the rolling pin. "Go write the letter." I went. And something in the set of his shoulders when he left was different from when he'd come in, lighter somehow, like a thing he'd been holding had been set down. Tom appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later. You straighten the boy out, he said. I gave him a direction, Clara said. He'll straighten himself out. Tom came in, got himself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table with the ease of a man who'd decided some weeks ago that this kitchen was somewhere he was allowed to be. He's been carrying that letter around for 2 weeks, he said. Almost asked Hector about it. Hector told him he'd rather face a bull than help with a love letter, which fair enough. Clara smiled just slightly and said nothing. You're good with people, Tom said. It wasn't flattery, it was observation, the same tone he'd used to note that a horse had good bones. Always know the right amount to say. I've had a lot of practice knowing when to stop talking, Clara said. Tom turned his coffee cup in his hands. The Bennett family. He said it without inflection, not a question. Among others. I was quiet for a moment. Then, for what it's worth, what they did. Sending you out here like... He stopped. Wasn't right. Clara kept working. No, it wasn't. Wyatt doesn't know the full of it. What Gerald said to him in that letter. She looked up. What did Gerald say? Tom's jaw tightened slightly. Said you were a burden the family could no longer manage. Said you'd probably be difficult, but that Callahan seemed like the type who could handle difficult. He met her eyes. I happened to be in the yard when Pete brought the letter out. Wyatt read it, and I've known him a long time, ma'am. I've seen him angry twice. That was the third time. Clara was very still. He was angry, she said. He wrote Gerald back, Tom said. Told him he'd take you in, but not on Gerald's terms. Told him no arrangement would be necessary, that if you came here, you came as a person and not a parcel. And if Gerald had a problem with that framing, he should find somewhere else to send you. He took a sip of coffee. Gerald wrote back and agreed to everything because Gerald Bennett doesn't push back on a man who owns 600 acres and has a reputation for following through. Clara stood at the counter and thought about the letter Harriet had set on the kitchen counter without a word. About the sealed thing that had contained her fate in someone else's handwriting. About the fact that Wyatt Callahan, 2 weeks before she arrived, had already decided she was going to be treated like a human being. She had not known that. She had walked into this ranch expecting management and received something else entirely, and she had chalked it up to the man's character without understanding that the character had already been in motion before she got here. Why are you telling me this? She said. Tom set down his cup. Because you've been here a month, and I've watched you operate like you're still waiting for the other shoe to drop. He looked at her directly. There isn't another shoe, ma'am. Not from this house. He stood, picked up his hat, and went back to work. Clara stood in the kitchen alone for a long moment. Then she picked up the rolling pin and went back to the pie, but her hands were not entirely steady, and it had nothing to do with the crust. That evening after supper, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, she went looking for Wyatt. She found him at the fence line along the south pasture, checking the repair work from the week before, where cinders had found the wire. The sun was going down, and the heat of the day was finally softening, and he had his hat pushed back and was running his hand along a fence post with the focus of a man conducting a conversation with the wood. "Can I talk to you?" she said. He turned. "You can." She came to stand beside him at the fence. She'd decided on the walk over that she was going to say this plainly, because plain was the only register she trusted when something actually mattered. "Tom told me about the letter you wrote to Gerald Bennett," she said, "before I came." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He turned back to the fence post. "Tom talks too much." "He talks exactly enough," Clara said. "I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish before you say anything back." He waited. "I came here thinking I knew what this was," she said. "I thought I was being managed. I thought you were a decent man doing a decent man's minimum, which was more than I expected and less than I needed, and I was prepared to work with that." She looked at the fence, not at him. "I was wrong about what this was. And I'm not accustomed to being wrong about things like that, so it's taking me a moment to recalibrate." He said nothing. "What I mean," she said, "is thank you, for the letter, for deciding before I arrived that I was going to be a person here." Her voice was level. She kept it level deliberately. "It mattered. I didn't know it mattered at the time, but it did." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. The evening was settling around them, the particular hush that comes to a working ranch when the day's hard labor gives way to whatever comes before dark. "Gerald's letter made me angry," he said finally. His voice was even controlled, but there was something under it. "The way he wrote about you, like you were something he'd found in a corner of a room." He turned a fence nail in his fingers. "I've got no patience for men who treat people like inconveniences. Never have." "I noticed," Clara said quietly. He glanced at her. "I don't want your gratitude for treating you decently. That's not a thing a person should have to be grateful for." "No," she said. "It shouldn't be. But it is because decency isn't as common as it ought to be, and pretending otherwise doesn't make it more common." She finally looked at him directly. "So I'm saying thank you, and then we don't have to discuss it again." Something in his face settled, not quite relief, but adjacent to it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood at the fence for a moment longer, not talking. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. It had the quality of a silence between two people who've said what needed saying and have agreed without discussion that the saying was enough. "Billy asked about his letter," Wyatt said eventually. "Did he?" "He wanted to know if I thought you were right about it." He glanced at her sidelong. "I told him I hadn't read it. He described what you told him to do. I told him you were right." "You don't know what I told him." "I know enough." He put the fence nail in his shirt pocket. He came out of that kitchen looking like a man who'd just been given permission to be himself. "Whatever you said, it was the right thing." Clara absorbed that. "He's a good boy," she said. "He just needs someone to tell him that wanting to be known is not the same as weakness." "Most men need someone to tell them that," Wyatt said. He said it simply, not as a confession, but she heard what was underneath it anyway. She didn't push. She was still learning that Wyatt's openings were like the ranch's water supply. Patient, deliberate, better approached without urgency. She said goodnight and walked back to the house. 2 days later, the letter from Billings arrived. Billy practically ran from the mailbag to the kitchen, holding the envelope in both hands like it was a bird he was afraid to crush. Clara was at the stove. He stood in the doorway, bouncing slightly on his heels, and she looked at him. "Open it then," she said. He opened it. "Read it." His face went through about 7 distinct phases in under a minute, ending somewhere in the vicinity of stunned joy. She said, He stopped, started again. She said it was the best letter I'd ever written her. She said she read it 3 times. He looked up from the page. She said, "When I wrote about feeling like I was trying to answer a song with a list," she cried. He blinked. Why would she cry about that? That's not sad. "She cried because you were real with her," Clara said. "That moves people, Billy. Being real with them when you didn't have to be." He stood there holding the letter with the expression of a young man discovering that honesty actually works, which was, Clara thought, one of the more important discoveries a person could make. "Thank you," he said. "Ma'am, I mean it." "Write her back," Clara said. "This time without the weather." He grinned a real grin, the kind that takes over a face without asking permission, and went. Tom, leaning in the kitchen doorway with his coffee cup, watched him go. "You're going to make that boy insufferable," he said. "He's going to be walking around here with his chest out for a week." "Good," Clara said. "He should." Tom chuckled, a short, genuine sound she'd rarely heard from him. He shook his head and went back to work. It was Hector who brought her the first warning. I didn't come to her directly. That wasn't his method. He came in the evening, sat at the table with the bridle that he'd been working on for 3 weeks. She'd long since concluded that the bridle was an excuse, not a project. And he said without preamble, "Couple of men from town came out to the North Road today." Clara kept washing dishes. "What men?" Didn't recognize them, but they were asking Jimmy about the ranch, about who was living here now. He rubbed at the leather. Jimmy told them it was Callahan's place, and always had been. They asked specifically about a woman. Her hands slowed in the water. What did they want to know? "Whether you were still here," Hector said. "Whether you looked his word was comfortable." Clara turned around. Hector was looking at her now, steady and direct, and she thought about Tom's words again. He trusts what he sees. "Did Jimmy tell Wyatt?" she said. "Jimmy told me. I'm telling you." A pause. "Because you should know before anyone decides to manage it for you." She dried her hands, set the cloth down. "Who do you think sent them?" Hector said nothing. He didn't need to. She went to find Wyatt. How was in the barn, as he often was, in the late evening going over the next day's work, in his head the way she'd come to recognize standing in one spot, moving nothing except his eyes processing. He looked up when she came in. "Someone from town was on the North Road today," she said, "asking about me, asking if I looked comfortable." He didn't blink. "When?" "This afternoon. 2 men. Jimmy saw them." Wyatt's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it went hard and quiet the way a river does right before it changes its course. "Gerald," he said. "That's what I think. He's checking to see if you've settled." He looked at her directly. "Which means he's not done." Clara met his gaze. "What do you think he wants?" "I think Gerald Bennett is a man who sent away a problem and is now worried the problem isn't suffering enough." He set down the tool in his hand. "Men like that, they need to believe the story they told themselves. That you were a burden, that you were nothing without the Bennett name. If you're out here being not that—" He stopped. "Then he was wrong," Clara said. "Then he was wrong," Wyatt confirmed. "And men like Gerald Bennett would rather create a new problem than admit to an old one." The words sat between them in the warm dark of the barn. "He can't make me go back," Clara said. "There's nothing to go back to. Robert is gone. I have no legal obligation to the Bennett family." "No," Wyatt said. "But he could cause trouble if he wanted to. Talk to people in town. Shape the story of what you're doing out here, what this is." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this gets complicated." "I've been navigating complicated my entire life," Clara said. "What I'm asking you is whether you're prepared for it." The question landed flat and honest between them. She watched him absorb it. He looked at her for a moment with that reading expression, the one she'd catalogued that first day, and had been translating slowly ever since. "Yes," he said, simply, one word, like it wasn't even a close decision. She nodded. "All right then." She turned to leave the barn, and he said, "Clara." She stopped. "Whatever he tells people," Wyatt said, "about what this is or what you are, the people who matter already know the truth of it." His voice was low, and certain, the voice of a man stating something he's looked at from every side and decided is solid. "You've made sure of that." She didn't trust herself with a full sentence. "Good night, Wyatt," she said. "Good night," he said. She walked back to the house through the warm Montana night, and she thought about what he'd said. The people who matter already know the truth of it. She thought about Tom and his coffee cup and his slow-built respect. She thought about Billy and his letter and his chest-out grin. She thought about Hector bringing her the warning because she should know before anyone decides to manage it for you. She thought about the fact that for the first time in 11 years, the people around her were not trying to make her smaller. They were without fanfare, without announcement, with the unceremonious practicality of working people making room. She did not sleep well that night, but not because she was afraid, because something was becoming real that she hadn't allowed herself to name yet, and unnamed things have a particular weight when you're lying in the dark, trying not to think about them. She was up at 4 as usual, had the coffee on by 4:30, was rolling the biscuit dough at 4:50 when she heard the sound that didn't belong. Not a ranch sound, not the ordinary creak and settle of the buildings and animals, but the sound of a horse coming up the road at a pace that meant something. She went to the door. The rider was Pete. He came into the yard fast and pulled up, and his face in the early dark had the particular look of a young man carrying news he didn't want to deliver. "Mrs. Bennett," he said. "I'm sorry for the hour. Mr. Gerald sent me ahead. He's coming out tomorrow morning, him and 2 other men." He said it fast, like getting it over with. "He says he's coming to check on the arrangement, make sure everything is he said proper." Clara stood in the doorway, with the cool pre-dawn air moving around her, and looked at Pete's apologetic face. "He's not coming to check on the arrangement," she said. Pete looked at his hands. No, ma'am. I don't reckon he is.
Does Mr. Callahan know? I was going to go to the barn. I'll tell him. She looked at Pete. You get your horse some water. You've had a long ride.
She turned back into the house, put the biscuit dough aside, walked through the kitchen, through the main room, and knocked firmly on Wyatt's bedroom door. He answered inside of 10 seconds, fully alert in the way of a man who spent 20 years where emergencies don't announce themselves. He opened the door, took one look at her face, and said, "What happened?" "Gerald Bennett is coming tomorrow morning," Clara said. "He's bringing 2 men." Wyatt's face went through nothing dramatic. It simply settled the way a hand closes around something it intends to hold. "All right," he said. His voice was absolutely even. "He's not coming to check on the arrangement," Clara said, same as she'd said to Pete, because she wanted to make sure they were speaking plainly. "No," Wyatt agreed. "He's not." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you afraid?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm angry," she said. Something crossed his face. Then, not surprise, but a recognition, the expression of a man who has heard the right answer. "Good," he said quietly. He held her gaze for one steady moment. "Let him come," Wyatt said. Gerald Bennett arrived at 9 in the morning. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 men. Clara didn't recognize both of them with the particular bearing of people who've been hired to stand behind someone important and look like they agree with everything. He also brought Nora, his wife, which was the detail that told Clara everything she needed to know about the nature of this visit. Gerald never brought Nora to anything that was purely business. He brought Nora when he wanted a witness. When he wanted someone who could later confirm with a woman's credibility whatever version of events he intended to construct. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horses. She didn't go to the window. She finished what she was doing, wiping down the counter after the breakfast cleanup, folded the cloth over the basin edge, and walked to the front of the house. Wyatt was already on the porch. He hadn't gone out to meet them at the road. He was standing on his own porch, on his own ground, with his arms loose at his sides and his hat on straight, and he had the expression of a man who has decided in advance that nothing coming up that road is going to move him. Clara came through the front door and stood beside him. She felt Gerald see her the moment she appeared. Felt the small recalibration in his posture, the slight tightening that happened when something he'd expected to find diminished turned out to be standing upright. Gerald dismounted. He was in his good coat. That was another detail. He'd dressed for this. "Callahan," he said, touching the brim of his hat. He looked at Clara. "Clara. First name, no Mrs. Bennett." The erasure of her married name was so practiced she almost missed it. "Gerald," she said. She gave him nothing else. He looked back at Wyatt. "I hope we're not interrupting." "You are," Wyatt said pleasantly. "But you knew that when you came. Get down, all of you. I'll have someone see to the horses." It was not quite an invitation and not quite a command, and left Gerald with no graceful option except to comply. He came up the porch steps with his 2 men behind him and Nora following, and Clara looked at Nora's face as she came up and saw what she'd always seen there. A woman doing careful arithmetic about what her husband needed from her in the next few minutes. She felt a brief, complicated pang for Nora. Then she put it away. Wyatt brought them into the front room. Clara went to the kitchen and came back with coffee, not because she was performing hospitality, but because having something in your hands gave people something to look at that wasn't your face, and right now she wanted to watch Gerald's face without him noticing that she was doing it. Gerald sat, looked around the room with the particular scanning attention of a man assessing property. Then he looked at Clara and said, "You look well." "I am well," Clara said. "The arrangement seems to be suiting you." "It does." Gerald shifted. He'd expected her to be either grateful or brittle, she could tell. She was giving him neither, and it was costing him his script. He turned to Wyatt. "I wanted to come out personally, make sure everything was in order, that the situation was what we'd discussed." "What did we discuss?" Wyatt said. His voice was conversational, almost mild. Almost. Gerald's eyes moved. "You know what I mean, Callahan. That Clara was being looked after. That she had what she needed." "She has what she's earned," Wyatt said. which is considerable. She runs this house, she manages the kitchen. She's got 8 men who work harder and eat better than they did 3 months ago. He held Gerald's gaze. Is that the situation you came to check on? A pause. I also came, Gerald said carefully, because there are people in town who have questions about the nature of the arrangement here. There it was. Clara set her coffee cup down on the side table. She set it down gently, deliberately, the way you set something down when you're making a choice about the next 10 seconds. Then she looked at Gerald directly. Say what you mean, Gerald, she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen on his face 100 times in 11 years. The expression that said he found her directness impolite and her existence inconvenient, and somehow both of those things were her fault. There is talk, he said, about a widow living alone on a man's ranch, without proper arrangement. I work here, Clara said. I am paid for the work. That is the arrangement. People don't always see it that simply. Then people need better things to do with their time. She kept her voice even. She had made a decision sometime in the hours between Pete's arrival and this morning that she was not going to manage Gerald's comfort today. Not once. Not even slightly. What is it you actually want, Gerald? Not what the town is saying. What do you want? Gerald looked at her, and for just a moment under the careful coat and the prepared face, she saw the real thing, the small mean calculation of a man who needed her to be less than she was. Because if she wasn't, then what they'd done to her required a reckoning he wasn't prepared to make. I want to know, he said slowly, that Robert's wife is conducting herself in a manner that doesn't embarrass his memory. The room went completely still. Clara heard Tom shift on his feet in the hallway. He was there. She'd been aware of him for 10 minutes, standing just around the corner, with the transparent casualness of a man who just happened to be in that part of the house. She heard Hector's boot on the back porch step. She heard Billy's voice out in the yard drop mid-sentence and go quiet. She heard Wyatt set his coffee cup down. I want to make sure I understood you right, Wyatt said. His voice had not changed. That was the part that made Gerald's 2 men glance at each other. You came out here to my home to suggest that Clara, a woman who has worked from before sunrise to after sunset, every day. She's been here, who has managed this household with more skill and more dignity than anyone I've had on this property, that she is somehow embarrassing a man who has been dead for 6 months. Gerald opened his mouth. Who has been dead for 6 months. Gerald opened his mouth. Don't, Wyatt said, still the same mild voice. I'm not finished. He looked at Gerald the way a man looks at something he's measured and found small. You sent her here. You put her on a wagon like freight, and you sent her to a stranger's door because she inconvenienced you. And now she's out here building something real, and that bothers you. So you dressed up your discomfort in Robert's name and drove 2 hours to deliver it to her face. He paused. I want you to hear yourself. Gerald's face had gone the particular color of a man who is angry and embarrassed in equal measure and trying to look like he's above both. I have concerns. You have guilt, Wyatt said flatly. Those aren't the same thing. Nora made a small sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Clara looked at her and found Nora looking at her hands. Gerald stood up. It was a mistake standing put him in the position of having to decide what to do next, and he clearly hadn't planned past sitting. This conversation is not... Clara. Wyatt looked at her. Is there anything you want to say to him? She'd thought about this. She'd lain in the dark the night before and thought carefully about what she wanted from this moment, what she'd regret not saying, what she'd regret saying, and where the line was between those two things. She stood up. She faced Gerald Bennett, who had never called her by her first name and never called her by her married name, and had managed 11 years of living in the same orbit without ever once treating her as a full person, and she said what she'd decided. I spent 11 years in your family's house making myself useful enough to justify the space I took up, she said. I cooked and cleaned and managed and organized, and I was good at it better than you ever acknowledged, and at the end of it, when Robert was gone, and I was of no further use to you, you put me on a wagon and sent me away with a week's worth of coins and a letter that described me as a burden. She kept her voice level. She'd made that decision, and she was keeping it. What I want you to understand, Gerald, is that the worst thing you have ever done to me is also the best thing that has ever happened to me. So I don't have a grievance to air. I have a life to get back to." She looked at him with the steady calm of a woman who has finally completely put down a heavy thing. "We're done here." Gerald stared at her. He had come here to find a woman who was making the best of a difficult situation. Grateful, perhaps. Chastened. Something he could manage and contain and report back to the town with the comfortable story intact. He had found something else entirely. He looked at Wyatt, who had not moved from his chair and had no intention of doing so. He looked at Tom, who had come around the corner from the hallway and was standing in the doorway to the front room with the still patient presence of a large man who is waiting to see whether he's going to be needed. He looked at Clara one more time. Then he picked up his hat from his knee. "Come, Nora," he said. Nora stood. But before she followed her husband, she paused just for a second, just long enough for it to be deliberate, and she looked at Clara with an expression that had something in it Clara hadn't expected. Not quite apology, closer to recognition. The look of a woman who has seen something she couldn't quite let herself say out loud. Then she walked out. Gerald's men followed. Gerald went last, which was the choice of a man who needed to believe he was still controlling the order of things. Wyatt walked them to the porch. He watched them mount, and he watched them ride out, and he did not say anything until the sound of the horses was gone down the road. Then he came back inside. Tom was still in the doorway. "Want me to follow them to the property line?" he said. "No," Wyatt said. "They won't come back." "You sure?" Wyatt looked at Clara. "He got what he came for," he said. "He just didn't get the version he wanted." He held her gaze for a moment. "You all right?" She was. That was the strange part. She'd expected the confrontation to cost her something, to open some wound. She'd been keeping closed to pull her back into the orbit of everything she'd been trying to move away from. Instead, she felt the way she'd felt on the wagon that first morning, watching the Bennett property disappear behind a curtain of dust. Like something was behind her. Like she was facing forward now. "I'm fine," she said. "I need to start dinner." Tom made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to work. But the day was not finished delivering things Clara hadn't expected. It was mid-afternoon, the long quiet stretch between the morning's drama and the evening meal, when Wyatt found her in the garden she'd started at the side of the house. She'd put it in during the second week, nothing formal, just a working kitchen, garden herbs, and a few late-season vegetables. It was the one place on the property that was unambiguously hers, and she came to it when she needed to think without anyone asking her anything. She heard his boot on the path and looked up. He crouched down at the edge of the garden, not coming in, and looked at what she'd planted. "This wasn't here before," he said. "I should have asked," Clara said. "I'll move it if—" "I didn't say that." He looked at the herbs. "What is it?" "Rosemary. Thyme. Some sage. The tomatoes probably won't make it before the first frost, but I wanted to try." She sat back on her heels. "There's something about things you put in the ground. Tells you you're planning to still be somewhere." Howe was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to say what he was considering. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can. When you were in that room this morning, talking to Gerald." He looked at the garden, not at her. "Were you afraid of him?" "No," she said. "I was afraid of myself. That I'd say too much or too little, or say it in the wrong key, and it would come out like grief instead of what it actually was." "What was it actually?" she considered. "Clarity," she said. "I think. The kind you only get when you stop being confused about what something costs you." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that. "Wyatt," she said. He looked at her. "Tom told me before Gerald came, about the letter you wrote back to him, before I arrived." She watched his face. Why? Howe was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because my wife—" He stopped, started differently. "Margaret came to this ranch as a practical arrangement too. Her family needed the land security. My family needed the connection. That's how it was done that generation." He turned a small stone in his fingers. She never said it was a hardship. She was not a woman who complained. But there were things I understood later after that I hadn't understood when I could have done something about them. His jaw tightened slightly. I wasn't going to look at another woman arriving at this door in an arrangement somebody else designed and not make it right from the start what I could make right. Clara watched him. He was not looking at her, still looking at the garden, at the stone in his hand, at the middle distance where people look when they're saying something they've kept interior for a long time. "You're a good man," she said. He looked at her then sharply, like the words had landed wrong somehow. "Don't say that," he said. It wasn't harsh, it was almost pained. "Why not?" "Because good men don't spend 8 years being angry at themselves and calling it grief." He set the stone down carefully. "And because you don't know me well enough yet to be sure." The word yet hung in the air between them. She felt it. She was certain he did too. "All right," she said. "I'll wait." Something in his expression shifted, fractured almost in a controlled way, like a thing that's been very still for a very long time and has just been asked to move. He looked at her for a moment that lasted a precise beat longer than any previous one. Then he stood. "Dinner's at 6, he said. As if she didn't know. As if he needed to say something ordinary. "I know when dinner is," she said. "Right." He touched the brim of his hat. That gesture, that small economical gesture that she had come to understand, was his version of a whole sentence, and went back toward the barn. Clara looked at the garden, looked at the tomatoes that probably wouldn't make it. She thought she might plant more in the spring. 3 days passed quietly. The kind of quiet that follows a storm, not peaceful exactly, but a different quality of air. The hands moved around the ranch with their usual efficiency, but there was a lightness to it, the specific lightness of people who have witnessed something satisfying and are still carrying the warmth of it. Billy had started whistling in the mornings. Tom had taken to making a second cup of coffee without asking, which in his language was approximately the same as a standing ovation. Hector, who had not elaborated on his comment about Wyatt seeing something, had begun sitting closer to the kitchen door in the evenings, which Clara interpreted correctly as his version of being present. On the evening of the third day, she was finishing the supper dishes when Wyatt came in later than usual and sat at the table and said nothing for long enough that she knew something had happened. She dried her hands, sat across from him, waited. "Man from town came out today," he said. "Lawyer. Fellow named Beaumont." Her spine went straight. "I don't know a Beaumont." "Gerald hired him," Wyatt said. He looked at the table. "Beaumont came to inform me that Gerald is filing a formal petition. He's claiming that Robert Bennett's estate, what's left of it, should include a provision for Clara Bennett as a dependent. He says without that provision, your living here constitutes an irregular arrangement that reflects poorly on the family name." Clara stared at him. "He's filing a legal claim," she said. "He's filing a legal document that doesn't have much actual standing," Wyatt said. Beaumont was careful about the language. "It's not a lawsuit, it's a petition. Something designed to be noticed rather than won." He looked at her. "If it becomes a matter of public record, the town will talk." "The town is already talking." "Yes, but there's a difference between rumor and a legal document with Gerald Bennett's name on it." His voice was steady, but underneath it she could hear something she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger. Something that had more heat than anger. Something that was personal. "He can't take you from here. He has no legal authority over you. But he can make staying here uncomfortable. For you. Socially." Clara sat with that for a moment. "Can we respond?" she said. "Legally." Beaumont suggested that the most effective response would be... Wyatt stopped. "Say it plainly," she said. He looked at her. His jaw was set, and his eyes were direct, and she could see very clearly that the next sentence cost him something. "Marriage," he said. "A formal arrangement would remove the legal ambiguity Gerald is trying to exploit. It would also..." He stopped again. "It would also make whatever he files irrelevant. You'd be Clara Callahan, not Robert Bennett's widow being housed at a stranger's ranch." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has just done something he can't take back and isn't certain whether he wants to. Is that the only reason? She said. A long pause. The longest pause he'd given her. No, he said. She took a breath. Let it out slowly. This was the moment she'd been careful around for weeks, the thing she'd noticed and filed and refused to name, and had been moving toward anyway. The way water moves toward low ground, regardless of the obstacles. Wyatt, she said. I'm not going to answer that question tonight. He nodded immediately, like he'd expected this, like he'd have been surprised by anything else. All right. I need to think, she said. Not about whether I trust you. I do. Not about whether I... She stopped herself. I need to think about what I'm deciding, what it means, what I'm building and why. I understand, he said. And she believed him. But I want you to know something, she said. While I'm thinking. He waited. I planted that garden, she said, because I was planning to still be here. She watched those words find him. Watched the thing they did to his face, not the dramatic softening of a man being rescued, but the quiet shift of a man who has been bracing against something and has just been given permission for the first time in 8 years to stop. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He stood slowly and touched the brim of his hat and went to bed. Clara sat in the kitchen alone. She heard the ranch settling around her, the horses in the barn, the creek, the bunkhouse, the particular creaks and sighs of a house that had held one person's solitude for 8 years, and was figuring out room by room how to hold more. She thought about Gerald, who had filed a legal document because he could not tolerate being wrong about what she was worth. She thought about Wyatt, who had said no, and then said yes, and had looked at her while he said it with the eyes of a man who had stopped pretending he didn't care what her answer was going to be. She thought about the garden. She thought about spring. She blew out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark, and thought about the fact that Gerald Bennett, in his determination to punish her, had handed her something she could not have found on her own. He had handed her a man who wrote letters before she arrived, a house that needed warmth, a crew that needed someone to notice them, a garden that needed planting. He had handed her against every intention a life, and now he was trying to take it back. She stared at the ceiling. I was going to find out what happened when you tried to take something from a woman who had finally figured out what she was worth. She closed her eyes. Morning would come early. She intended to be ready. She gave him her answer 4 days later. Not because she needed 4 days to decide she'd known if she was honest with herself somewhere around the third night of lying in the dark, thinking about gardens and spring, and the way Wyatt Callahan said no, and then said yes, and looked at her while he said it. She needed 4 days because she refused to answer a question of that magnitude from a place of reaction. Gerald had filed his petition. She was not going to let Gerald's maneuvering be the thing that made her decision. She was going to make the decision herself on her own terms when she was certain it was hers. On the 4th morning, she came to the barn before breakfast. Wyatt was already up, already working the way. He always was, moving through the stalls with the unhurried efficiency that she'd come to understand was not indifference, but discipline. The discipline of a man who has learned that the work doesn't wait for your feelings to settle, so you move your body through the work and let the feelings sort themselves alongside. She stood at the barn door. He heard her and turned. She said yes. He went very still. Not because of Gerald, she said. Not because of the petition, or Beaumont, or what the town is saying. I want you to understand that clearly. She held his gaze. Because I trust you. Because I know what kind of man you are, and I've known it for longer than I've let myself say. And because... She stopped, took a breath. Because I planted that garden, and I meant it. Wyatt set down the brush in his hand. He crossed the barn in 5 steps, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she could see every year of the 8 hard ones in his face, and he said, Clara, I have not been a man who hoped for much these last years. I know, she said. I want you to know that I mean this. Not as a legal arrangement. Not as a practical solution. His voice was low and deliberate. Each word placed with the care of a man who has thought about what it means to say things and have them not be enough. I mean this as a man standing in front of a woman he has come to... He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. Admire is too small a word. I haven't found the right word yet. But I intend to. Something in Clara's chest, something that had been clenched and careful for 11 years, opened without dramatics, quietly, the way a window opens when the latch is finally turned. You have time to find it, she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, just his hand covering hers, warm and calloused and certain. All right then, he said. All right, she said. They stood like that for a moment in the early morning quiet of the barn. Two people who had been broken by different things and had rebuilt themselves with the careful stubbornness of people who refuse to stay down, and the simplicity of the moment was exactly right. No fanfare, no performance. Just two people deciding that what they'd built in these weeks was worth protecting. Then Clara said, "Breakfast is going to burn." Wyatt made that sound again, the one that was almost a laugh, and she turned and walked back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard him pick up the brush and go back to work. Tom found out at breakfast. Not because anyone told him he figured it out the way Tom figured most things out by watching the room with the quiet attention of a man who has learned that the important information is almost never the information that's said out loud. He looked at Clara. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at the way the morning had a different quality to it, the way a room has a different quality after the furniture has been rearranged into its right configuration. He said nothing until after the meal, when the hands were heading back out, and then he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara and said, "You're staying." It wasn't a question. "I'm staying," she said. Tom nodded once with the solemn deliberateness of a man ratifying something important. Then he turned and walked outside, and she heard him say something to Billy in the yard, something short and quiet, and she heard Billy's whoop of delight that was loud enough to startle the horses. Hector appeared at the kitchen door 30 seconds later. "Heard Billy," he said. "I expect they heard Billy in the next county," Clara said. Hector looked at her for a long moment with his steady, weathered face, and then he said, "Good." Just that. One word, in his particular way. But his eyes said everything the word left out. She turned back to the dishes before he could see her face do something she hadn't given it permission to do. They rode into town 3 days later. Clara and Wyatt to see Judge Alderton about the legal formalities. Clara had spent those 3 days thinking carefully about what Gerald's petition actually contained and what it actually threatened. Beaumont had been vague, deliberately vague, she'd decided, because a specific legal threat could be specifically countered, and a vague one was harder to fight. Gerald wasn't interested in winning a legal case. He was interested in creating a story that had traction. A story in which Clara was a woman of questionable character, living in irregular circumstances, and Wyatt was a man of poor judgment who'd been taken advantage of. She understood riding into town beside Wyatt with the summer heat already building and the road hard and dry beneath the horses that the marriage license was only part of what today was going to require. The other part was the town itself. The people who had been absorbing Gerald's version of events for months. The people who would look at her and Wyatt and decide in the first 30 seconds which story they believed. She sat up straight. She had always sat up straight. In the Bennett house, it had been armor. Today, it was simply true. They went to the courthouse first. Judge Alderton was a man of 60-something, with the careful eyes of someone who has seen enough human foolishness to find most of it unsurprising and all of it interesting. He shook Wyatt's hand. He looked at Clara with an assessment that was professional, not personal, and she held it without flinching. "Mrs. Bennett," he said. "Judge Alderton. I've heard Gerald Bennett has filed a petition regarding your living situation," he said without preamble. He was clearly a man who had no patience for circling. "He has," she said. "I assume you've read it." "I have." He looked at Wyatt. "And I assume this visit is the response." "Part of it," Wyatt said. Alderton looked back at Clara. "I'll tell you plainly, Mrs. Bennett. Bennett's petition has the legal substance of a strongly worded opinion. It doesn't compel any action. But it is a matter of public record, and in a town this size, public record has social weight that the law doesn't always have." He folded his hands on the desk. "A marriage license makes the petition moot. More than moot, it makes Gerald Bennett look like a man who filed a legal document to harass his dead brother's widow, which is what he is, and I suspect he's intelligent enough to have already figured out that this is how it ends. He's not intelligent, Clara said. He's calculating. Those aren't the same thing. Alderton looked at her. Then he almost smiled. No, he said. They aren't. He pulled out the necessary papers. Let's proceed. The license was straightforward. The signatures were made. Alderton wished them well with the brisk sincerity of a man who means it, but has 3 other cases waiting. What came next was not straightforward. Coming out of the courthouse, into the full weight of the mid-morning, Clara saw Dorothea Marsh standing across the street. Dorothea was 63 years old and had been the governing social authority of this town for at least 30 of those years, not through any official capacity, but through the more powerful mechanism of being the person whose opinion other people borrowed when they didn't have time to form their own. She was talking to 2 other women, and all 3 of them were looking at Clara and Wyatt with the intent, candid interest of people who are not bothering to pretend they're doing anything else. Clara made a decision. She looked at Wyatt and said, "I'm going to go speak with Dorothea Marsh." Wyatt looked across the street. His expression was careful. "That's a calculated risk." "Everything is," Clara said. "Stay here." She crossed the street alone. She kept her pace even. She did not rush, and she did not slow down, and she did not arrange her face into anything except what it actually was. Dorothea watched her come with the expression of a woman who is already deciding where this encounter fits into the story she's been building. "Mrs. Bennet," she said. "Mrs. Marsh," Clara said. "And I'll be Clara Callahan shortly. I thought you'd want to know that directly, rather than through whichever version Gerald Bennet's been circulating." Dorothea's chin lifted slightly. She was a woman who respected directness, even when it surprised her. "Gerald has expressed concern about your situation." "I know what Gerald has expressed," Clara said. "I also know that Gerald sent me to Wyatt Callahan's ranch because I was inconvenient to him, and that he has spent the months since trying to ensure that what he did looks acceptable by making sure I look unacceptable." She held Dorothea's gaze without aggression and without apology. "I've been managing the Callahan household, cooking for 8 men, running a kitchen and a garden and a house that hasn't had proper management in 8 years. I've been paid for the work and treated with respect. That's the situation. Whatever Gerald told you was the situation is the thing I just described with the dignity removed to make himself more comfortable." The 2 women behind Dorothea were absolutely still. Dorothea herself had not moved. "That's a plain way of putting it," she said. "I've found plain to be more efficient," Clara said. "I'm not interested in managing my reputation through inference. If people in this town want to know who I am and what I've been doing for the last 3 months, I'd rather they hear it from me." A pause. Dorothea looked across the street at Wyatt, who was standing at the edge of the road with the patience of a man who has committed to a course and is waiting for it to develop. "He wrote back to Gerald before you even arrived," Dorothea said almost to herself. Then she looked at Clara sharply. "Did you know that—" "I know it now. Gerald was furious about that letter," Dorothea said. "He came to my husband 2 months ago, wanting to build support, I suppose, for whatever he's been planning. My husband told him to manage his own family affairs." She looked at Clara with eyes that had been reading people for 6 decades and were currently doing so with full attention. "I didn't know what to make of you. I'll say that plainly since you prefer it." "And now," Clara said. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come to church Sunday, Mrs. Callahan. Bring your husband." Clara looked at her steadily. "We'll be there." She crossed back to Wyatt. He looked at her face and said nothing, which she had come to understand was his version of a question. "Sunday," she said. He nodded. "I heard. Is that a problem?" "I haven't been to church in 4 years," he said. "But no, it's not a problem." They walked to the general store, and the hardware supply, and the post office, and at every stop, Clara noticed the shift, the slight recalibration, the reassessment, the moment when people who had been absorbing Gerald's story encountered the actual Clara Bennet and found the 2 things didn't match. She was not aggressive about it. She was not performing. She simply was what she was said, what she meant, and let people draw their conclusions. It was at the post office that they encountered Beaumont. He was coming out as they were going in, and he stopped when he saw Wyatt, and then he saw Clara. And something happened in his face that was not quite guilt, but was related to it. "Callahan," he said. He looked at Clara. "Mrs. Bennet." "Callahan," Clara said pleasantly. "I understand you'll need to inform your client that his petition is now moot." Beaumont blinked. He looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him with the steady, comfortable patience of a man who has nothing to explain. "I was retained to deliver a legal document," Beaumont said. He sounded slightly like a man who had realized the job was a mistake and was now managing the exit. "My professional relationship with Mr. Bennet is your business," Clara said. "I'm simply noting that the petition no longer has a subject. Whatever Gerald chooses to do with that information is up to him." She held the door open. "Good day, Mr. Beaumont." He went. They did their business at the post office. When they came out, Wyatt looked at her with something in his face that she was learning to read, as the thing he felt when she did something that he had not expected, but had in retrospect understood, was inevitable. "You've been planning that since this morning," he said. "Since Tuesday," she said. He shook his head slowly, and this time the sound he made was entirely fully a laugh. It was the first time she'd heard his real laugh. It was quiet, and it was real, and it did something to his face that made him look like the man he must have been before 8 years of solitary grief had taught him to keep everything measured. She decided she was going to hear that laugh as often as possible, for as long as she lived. "Let's go home," she said. They rode back in the late afternoon, and the word home sat in the air between them, easy and uncontested, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else about it. The Sunday service was where Gerald made his last move. Clara had expected something. She'd known Gerald well enough for 11 years to know that a man of his particular makeup doesn't retreat cleanly. He retreats to a new position and fires from there. What she hadn't anticipated was that he would do it in church in front of the entire congregation with the confidence of a man who has decided that public humiliation is his last available weapon. He and Nora were already seated when Wyatt and Clara came in. Clara felt Gerald's eyes track her the moment she came through the door. She did not look at him. She looked at Dorothea Marsh, who was in her usual pew near the front, and Dorothea gave her a look that was simultaneously a greeting and a warning. They sat. The service proceeded. And then during the period after the formal service when the congregation gathered to speak, Gerald stood up. He positioned himself near the front where everyone could see him, and he said in the carrying voice of a man who has rehearsed this, "I want to address something that affects this community. About the nature of the arrangement between Wyatt Callahan and my late brother's widow, and what it says about the standards we—" Gerald. It was Dorothea Marsh. He stopped. Dorothea stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she occupied space the way very certain people do, completely without apology. "I think you'll find," she said in the measured tone of someone delivering a verdict, "they've already decided that this community is not interested in the arrangement you're attempting to describe. What we are interested in is the fact that Clara Callahan," she used the name deliberately with precision, "has been conducting herself with more dignity under difficult circumstances than most of us could manage. And that Wyatt Callahan, who has been a member of this community for 20 years without giving us a single cause for concern, has done right by her." She looked at Gerald with the focused calm of a woman who has governed this town's social landscape for 30 years and knows exactly how much weight her words carry. "If you have a concern about your family's business, Gerald, I'd suggest you address it within your family, not here." The room was absolutely silent. Gerald looked at Dorothea. He looked at the faces around him, faces that were not giving him what he'd come here expecting, not the concerned nodding of people who'd been successfully alarmed, but the particular blank attention of people who have already made up their minds and are simply waiting for the person who hasn't accepted it yet to finish. He looked at Nora. And Nora did something that Clara had not expected and would not forget. Nora said quietly but audibly, "Gerald, sit down." He looked at his wife as if she'd spoken in a language he didn't recognize. "Sit down," she said again. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was the voice of a woman who had been sitting down and staying quiet for a very long time and had just used up the last of her patience for it. Gerald sat down. The room exhaled. Clara looked at the back of Nora's head and thought about the look Nora had given her when she left the ranch that first day. The look that was close to recognition. The look of a woman who had seen something she couldn't say out loud. She thought about what it must have cost Nora in that room full of people to spend that particular currency. After the service, when people were filing out, Nora found Clara near the door. Gerald was talking to someone across the room, pointedly not looking in their direction. Nora stopped in front of Clara. She was a composed woman, had always been composed. It was the thing about her that had made her difficult to read, but there was something different in her face today. Something had been resolved. "I read the petition," Nora said quietly. "Before Gerald filed it. I told him not to." Clara looked at her. "He didn't listen," Nora said. "He rarely does." She paused. "I want you to know that I never believed what he said about you. In the house. What he told people about why you were being sent away." Her voice was careful and precise. "I should have said so at the time. I didn't. And I've thought about that." "Nora," Clara said. She kept her voice gentle because Nora didn't need to be pressed. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because I watched you walk into that room and handle my husband with more grace than he deserved," Nora said. "And I thought if she can do that having been treated the way she was, then I can at least say I'm sorry for the part I played in it." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Then I accept that." Nora's shoulders dropped slightly, the dropping of something that had been held up for months. "He's going to withdraw the petition," she said. "I told him this morning he either withdraws it or I will have a very long conversation with my brother, who is also Gerald's primary creditor." A pause. "Gerald is a calculating man. He can calculate that." Clara absorbed that. "You didn't have to." "No," Nora said. "I didn't. But I've been not having to for 11 years, and I find I'm tired of it." She straightened. "Congratulations on your marriage, Clara. I mean that." She walked away. Clara stood for a moment at the church door, watching Nora go back to Gerald, watching the way Nora's spine was straight and her chin was level, and Gerald looked at her when she approached with an expression that suggested he'd received his accounting and understood its terms. Wyatt appeared at Clara's shoulder. He'd been close enough to hear she knew. "Nora Bennett," he said quietly. "Apparently," Clara said. "I didn't see that coming." "Neither did I." She turned and looked at him. "Are you all right?" He looked faintly startled that she'd asked, not because it was an unwelcome question, but because he'd been so thoroughly in the habit of not being asked. He paused. "Yes, I think so." He looked at her. "I'm better than all right," she said. And she meant it. She meant it in the specific grounded way that only becomes possible when you've gone through the thing you were afraid of and found out it didn't break you. She'd stood in that room in front of the people who'd been absorbing a story about her for months, and she'd simply been herself, and being herself had been enough. More than enough. That was new. That was entirely new. They drove home in the afternoon, and the town behind them felt like a chapter whose last paragraph had finally been written. What awaited them at the ranch was something that neither the town nor Gerald Bennett had any further say in. What awaited them was what they'd built. Tom came out when he heard the wagon, which was unusual. Tom was not a man who came out to meet people being of the general opinion that if they got as far as the yard, they'd found the place adequately. He stood with his hat in his hand and looked at Clara and looked at Wyatt and said, "Well." "Well," Wyatt said. Tom put his hat back on. "Good." He turned and called toward the bunkhouse. "Billy." Billy appeared from around the side of the barn at a pace that made clear he'd been waiting. "Well," Billy said. "Well," Clara said. Billy's grin took over his whole face. He turned and said something to someone inside the barn door, and a ripple of sound came back that was clearly the specific delight of 8 men who have been invested in an outcome and received the right one. Hector appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. "Supper's ready," he said. She stopped, stared at him. "You made supper." Somebody had to. He said it with the absolute dignity of a man who has done something extraordinary and sees no reason to make a production of it. Didn't burn it either. She walked past him into the kitchen and looked at the stove where a pot of stew was, in fact not burned, was in fact producing a smell that was not entirely without merit. And she turned around and looked at the old man in the doorway and said, "Hector." "Ma'am," he said. "Thank you." He nodded. Once. With full Hector gravity. "Next time you're on your own," he said. "I'm not a cook." "Noted," she said. "Absolutely noted." She heard Wyatt laughing, the real laugh, the one she'd first heard 3 days ago and had already decided she was going to spend the rest of her life hearing as often as possible. She heard Billy explaining to someone loudly the details of the day that he didn't actually know, but was constructing with great enthusiasm. She heard Tom's low voice editing Billy's account with the precision of a man who prefers accuracy, but has made peace with enthusiasm as an acceptable substitute. She stood in her kitchen, in her home, in her life, and she thought about the wagon and the quilt room and the sealed letter and the word burden delivered in Harriet Bennett's carrying voice through a plank wall. She thought about what they'd intended. She thought about what they'd made. And then she picked up the ladle because 8 men and 1 good man and a life she had built with her own 2 hands were waiting for supper, and she had never in her life let supper wait for sentiment. She served it hot. She always did. The petition was withdrawn on a Wednesday. Beaumont delivered the paperwork himself, which Clara thought was either professional courtesy or the act of a man who needed to see with his own eyes how the thing he'd been part of had ended. He came to the ranch in the mid-morning, asked for Wyatt, and handed over the documents with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a transaction they'd prefer not to linger over. Wyatt looked at the papers, looked at Beaumont. "That's it. That's it," Beaumont said. He hesitated just barely, just a flicker. "For what it's worth, Mr. Count, I advised against the petition from the beginning. A man's entitled to make his own choices about his legal strategy. But I want it on record that—" "It's not my record you need to put it on," Wyatt said. Beaumont looked at Clara. She was standing at the kitchen door. She'd come out when she heard the horse, and she'd stood there long enough to hear what she needed to hear, and now she was looking at Beaumont with the steady patience of a woman who has already decided not to spend any more energy on this chapter than it deserves. "I appreciate you coming in person," she said. "That was a decent thing to do." Beaumont nodded. He seemed slightly relieved, the relief of a man who expected consequences and received consideration instead, which is always more disorienting. He left. Clara watched him ride out and felt the road behind him close over like water smooth and final. She went back inside and put the kettle on. Wyatt came in a few minutes later and sat at the table and looked at the papers in his hand and then set them down. "It's done," he said. "I know." She poured the water. "How do you feel?" He considered the question with the care he gave to all questions that mattered. "Like something I'd been bracing against stopped pushing," he said. She looked at him. "That's exactly what it feels like," she said. He looked at the papers one more time. Then he folded them, stood up, and put them in the drawer of the kitchen cabinet where he kept documents that needed keeping. He closed the drawer with the firm final click of a man filing something underfinished. "Tom wants to move the herd to the north pasture this week," he said. "I'll need all hands." "I know," Clara said. "I'll pack trail meals." "You don't have to." "Wyatt." She gave him the look. He'd been learning the look for 2 months now, the particular patient expression that meant she was going to do the thing, and the conversation about whether she was going to do the thing was a courtesy, not an actual debate. He stopped, almost smiled. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. That was a Thursday. The week that followed was the kind of week that doesn't announce itself as significant while it's happening. It's only afterward, looking back, that you can see it was one of those weeks where the life you've been building settles into its permanent shape. The herd moved north. The trail meals were packed and eaten and appreciated, with Billy making a formal declaration over his second biscuit that Clara's cooking was the single greatest argument for civilization he'd ever encountered, which made Tom snort and Hector nod with the gravity of a man confirming a scientific fact. The work was hard and physical and constant and completely satisfying in the way only work you've chosen can be. Clara rode out with them the second day, not to drive cattle. She was clear about that, but because the supply wagon needed a driver, and because she had decided early on in her time here that the best way to understand a working ranch was to see all of it working. Wyatt had handed her the reins without comment, which was his version of approval. She watched him with the herd that day. She'd seen him work before around the barn at the fence lines with Cinders and the other horses. But she hadn't seen him in the full context of his own operation moving through it, like a man who knows every inch of 600 acres from the inside. He had a way with the cattle that reminded her of what she'd told him about the talking. The idea that what a frightened creature needs is not instructions, but the knowledge that the person near it is not afraid. He moved through the herd, and the animals made room for him calmly, the way you make room for someone you've decided to trust. Tom pulled his horse up beside her wagon at one point and watched Wyatt work and said without looking at her, "You know what I haven't heard in 8 years?" "What?" she said. "Him whistling." He nodded toward Wyatt, who was in fact whistling something low and tuneless, while he guided a stray back toward the group. "Hasn't done that since Margaret died." Tom looked at her, then briefly the look of a man making a point he's decided to make only once. "Just so you know." Clara said nothing. She watched Wyatt and the herd and the wide Montana morning, and she held Tom's words in her chest, where they sat with a warmth that she didn't try to diminish or explain. It was on the 4th day of the drive, when they'd made camp for the night, and the herd was settled, and the crew was tired and fed, and gradually moving toward sleep, that Wyatt sat beside her at the fire, and said with the directness that she'd come to love about him. The directness that meant he'd been carrying something, and had decided it was time to set it down. "I want to talk about the future." She looked at him. The fire was low, and the stars overhead were extraordinary, and neither of those things were going to appear in her description of this moment, because what mattered was the man beside her, and the particular quality of his voice when he said something that was true. "I'm listening," she said. "I've been thinking about what happens next," he said. "Not the legal things, those are done, but what this place can be." He looked at the fire. "Margaret and I talked about expanding, adding a second barn, maybe a small operation for the horses specifically. There's a market for good working horses that we never properly got into because—" He stopped. "Because things happened the way they happened. And now," Clara said, "now I find myself thinking about it again, wanting to build something." He looked at her. "More than I have been. More than maintenance." His voice was careful and honest. "I don't know how to ask this exactly, so I'll just ask it. Do you want that? To build something here, not just to live here, but to be part of building it?" Clara thought about the question. Not the answer, she knew the answer. She thought about what it meant that he was asking, that he was including her not as a resident of what he was building, but as a participant in what they would build. That the word "they" was implicit in everything he'd just said, even though he hadn't used it once. "Tell me about the horses," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then something in his face opened. Not the fractured, careful opening she'd seen before, when vulnerability surprised him, but a full, willing opening. The opening of a man who has been given permission to want something out loud. He talked for an hour. She listened, and asked questions, and argued 2 points she disagreed with, and agreed with 6 more, and by the end of it, they had the loose shape of a plan that was half his and half hers, and entirely theirs, and the fire had burned down to coals, and Tom, who was definitely asleep 20 feet away, had definitely not been listening, and Billy, who was also definitely asleep, had definitely heard every word, and would be thinking about it for weeks. "You disagreed with me about the southern grazing rotation," Wyatt said. "Because you're wrong about it," Clara said. "I've been running this ranch for 20 years. And for 20 years, you've been rotating that herd on a pattern that makes sense for cattle volume you had 10 years ago. You've got more now." She looked at him steadily. "You're wrong." A pause. "I'll look at the numbers again," he said. "I'll show you the numbers," she said. He looked at her with the expression that she'd come to think of as his true face, not the managed, measured face of a man who's learned to control what shows, but the real thing, the one that emerged in unguarded moments and always had the same quality to it. Like he still wasn't entirely sure she was real. Like he was still incrementally allowing himself to believe in something he'd stopped believing in. "Clara," he said. "Wyatt, I'm glad you're here," he said, simply, without decoration. "I know," she said. "So am I." They rode back to the ranch on the 5th day, and the life they'd been living resumed with the comfortable momentum of something that no longer needed to announce itself. And then September arrived, and with it something none of them had anticipated. A letter came from Gerald. Not from Beaumont. Not through any intermediary. In Gerald Bennett's own handwriting addressed to Clara, which was the first time he had ever written her name on anything. She opened it at the kitchen table with Wyatt across from her, and read it without expression. Then she read it again, because the first time through she wasn't certain she'd understood it correctly. She set it down. "Well?" she said. Wyatt looked at her. He didn't reach for the letter. He waited. "He's in financial trouble," she said. "The ranch, Robert's ranch, the Bennett property, he's been using the cattle operation as collateral on a loan he can't service. The creditor is calling it in." She looked at Wyatt. "He's asking if we want to buy the eastern section of the Bennett land. 40 acres. The section that borders your north pasture." Wyatt was very still. "He's selling Robert's land," he said. "Yes. To us. If we want it." Clara looked at the letter. He didn't use those words. He said he wanted to make sure the land went to someone who would manage it properly. He said he'd prefer a neighbor he knew over a land speculator from out of state. She paused. "He's embarrassed. You can see it in every sentence. He's found a way to reframe this as generosity, which is how Gerald will always manage anything that requires him to acknowledge he was wrong." "But it's still the land," Wyatt said. "It's still the land," she confirmed. She watched him think about it. She watched the calculation, and the history, and the complicated weight of what it meant move across his face in sequence. "What do you think?" he said. She had thought about it already. She'd been thinking about it since the second line of the letter because her mind worked that way ahead of the emotion, out to the consequence, back to the foundation. "I think the land is good land," she said. "I think it borders exactly the section you want for the horse operation. I think Gerald's price will be fair because he needs the money more than he needs the negotiating position." She held his gaze. "And I think Robert would have wanted that land managed by someone who wasn't going to let it run down." Wyatt looked at her. "You don't have to do this for Robert," he said carefully. "I'm not," she said. "I'm doing it for us. But it doesn't have to be only one thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll write him back today." "Use good paper," she said. "He notices things like that." Wyatt looked at her for a moment, and the almost laugh crossed his face, and then the real laugh followed it, and she felt it in her own chest, the way you feel a warm thing from across a room. He wrote the letter that afternoon. The negotiation took 2 weeks, conducted entirely through written correspondence, which suited both men perfectly, as neither of them was interested in a conversation that required the other to be present. Clara read every draft. She suggested 3 changes. Wyatt made 2 of them and told her plainly why he disagreed with the third. She considered his reasoning. She concluded he was right. She told him so. The land transferred on the 1st of October. Tom walked the boundary line that afternoon with Wyatt, the 2 of them moving through the new 40 acres with the practiced eye of men who evaluate land, the way other people evaluate character by what it's done and what it can do. When they came back, Tom said simply, "Good purchase," which was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation in Tom's register. Billy asked if this meant they were expanding. "Yes," Wyatt said. Billy's grin started. "Don't whoop," Tom said. Billy whooped anyway. It startled the horses less than it used to. They were getting used to Billy. Clara, watching from the porch, thought about the letter on the kitchen table. About Gerald's handwriting on the envelope with her name on it. About what it cost a man like Gerald to put her name on something he was sending voluntarily. She thought about Nora, who had told her husband to sit down in front of a full congregation and had meant every syllable. She thought about what Nora's life looked like from the inside, and she thought not for the first time that people were enormously more complicated than the roles they played, and that the roles they played were almost never the whole story. She went inside and wrote Nora a letter. Not about the land, not about Gerald. Just a letter, the kind of letter you write when you've decided that a person deserves to be addressed directly as themselves, rather than through the complicated intermediary of their husband's decisions. She thanked her for the church. She mentioned the garden. She said simply that if Nora ever wanted to come for a visit, she would be welcome. She mailed it on her next trip to town. She didn't tell Wyatt she'd written it. He found out 6 weeks later when Nora's reply arrived, and he read the address on the envelope and looked at Clara with the expression that said he understood exactly what she'd done and why, and was not going to say anything about it, except through the specific quality of his silence. "Good," he said after a moment. "I know," she said. It was November when everything shifted one final time, not dramatically. Not with a confrontation or a crisis or any of the sharp punctuation that the previous months had provided. It was a Tuesday evening, ordinary by every measure. When Hector came to the kitchen door with the bridle, he'd been working on a different one now, as the original had finally been completed sometime in September, and sat at the table and said without preamble, as was his way, "I'm thinking of retiring." Clara looked up from the pot she was stirring. "Retiring," she said. "I'm 67, he said. "My knee's been bad since August. I've got a sister in Bozeman." He rubbed at the leather. "I've been thinking about it for 2 years. I keep not doing it because—" He stopped. "Because the ranch wasn't ready," Clara said. He looked at her. "Because Wyatt wasn't ready," he corrected. "There's a difference." She understood what he was saying. She understood that for 8 years, Hector had stayed not because he needed to, but because he'd looked at a man he respected who was drowning quietly in his own loss, and had decided without announcement or acknowledgement to stay close enough to throw a rope if it came to that. "Is he ready now?" she said. Hector looked at her steadily. "You know he is," he said. She turned back to the pot. Her throat did something that she chose not to explain. "When?" she said. "Spring," he said. "After the calving." "That's sensible." "I'm a sensible man." "You are," she said. "You're also a good one." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm not going because things are bad here." "I know." "I'm going because things are good enough now that I can." He set the bridle down on the table. "I want you to understand that distinction." She turned around and looked at him. This man who had spent 20 years on a piece of land because he believed in the person running it, who had told her on a summer evening that Wyatt was seeing something, who had made supper on the day of her wedding with Hector Gravity and Hector Dignity, and not burned a single thing, and she said, "I understand it completely." He nodded, picked up the bridle, stood. "The biscuit recipe," he said. "I want it written down." She stared at him. "For my sister," he said with great dignity. "She's a poor cook." Clara turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see her face. "I'll write it down before spring," she said. "Don't forget the part about the rest," he said. "You told Billy to rest the dough. That's the part people always forget." "I'll write down the part about the rest," she said. "Good." He went to the door, paused. "You're good for him, Clara." She kept her face toward the stove. "He's good for me." "I know," Hector said. "That's why it works." And he went out. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment. The pot simmered. The ranch settled around her in the evening sounds she'd memorized over months. The barn, the bunkhouse, the creek, the particular rhythm of this place, breathing at the end of a day. She heard Wyatt's boot on the back porch. He came in, went to the basin, washed his hands. She heard him pause when he noticed she was very still at the stove. "What happened?" he said. "Hector's retiring in the spring." A pause. "I know," he said. "He told me last month." She turned around. "He told you last month?" "Yes." "And you didn't tell me?" "He asked me not to until he'd talked to you." Wyatt dried his hands, his face careful and honest. "He said he wanted to tell you himself." She considered that. Considered the old man's deliberate, exact way of doing things, the way he gave weight to the right things and withheld it from everything else. "That's very like him," she said. "Yes." Wyatt looked at her. "Are you all right?" She thought about it. I'm glad he's going, she said. I don't mean that the way it sounds. I mean, I know what you mean, Wyatt said quietly. He stayed for the right reasons, and now he's leaving for the right reasons. That's a good life, having reasons that are right. She looked at her husband. The word still had a new coin brightness to it, still caught her slightly by surprise from the inside when she thought it, and she thought about right reasons. She thought about being loaded onto a wagon. She thought about a sealed letter and a quilt room, and a name written on an envelope in Gerald Bennett's handwriting that she had not expected and had received anyway. She thought about gardens and spring and 40 acres of land that had once belonged to a gentle, steady man she'd been fond of now being worked toward something new by people who intended to do it justice. Wyatt, she said, I want to put in a proper vegetable garden in spring, not just the herbs, a real one, enough to supply the kitchen and then some. She held his gaze. And I want to start keeping records, proper records of the horse operation. Income, expenses, breeding lines, all of it. The way I kept the household accounts for the Bennetts, except this time for something that's actually ours. He looked at her. You kept their accounts. For 11 years, she said. They never paid me for it separately. It was just expected. She kept her voice even. I want to do it here, properly, as a real part of the operation. He didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. I'll need a proper desk, she said. Not the kitchen table. I'll build you one. She blinked. You'll build? I built most of this house, he said with a mildness that was not quite pride, but was related to it. I can build a desk. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the man who had written a letter before she arrived, who had handed her bread and a room and the right to leave if she wanted to, who had looked at her face on a sunny afternoon in a barn doorway and said yes simply and fully, like it wasn't even a close decision. She thought about what the Bennetts had intended. They had intended to diminish her, to place her somewhere inconvenient and let the inconvenience do the work of making her smaller. They had intended the wagon and the quilt room and the word burden, said through a wall to accomplish what years of slower erosion had not quite managed the final complete erasure of a woman they'd decided had no value. They had miscalculated. They had miscalculated the woman, and they had miscalculated the man, and they had miscalculated what happens when you put two people who have both been broken by loss and have both separately painstakingly rebuilt themselves in proximity to each other. What happens is not what you intended. What happens is a kitchen that smells like biscuits every morning. What happens is a crew of 8 men who work harder and argue less and take better care of the horses than they did 6 months ago. What happens is a legal petition that gets withdrawn and a land deal that gets made and a letter to a woman named Nora that comes back with a reply that sits in the kitchen drawer and gets reread on Tuesdays. What happens is a garden in November that is sleeping under the frost but is not dead, is in fact making plans for spring, is already deciding what it's going to become when the ground opens up again. What happens is a life. The desk appeared on a Saturday in late November. Wyatt had been working on it in the barn for 2 weeks. Clara had known she was not a woman who missed things that happened in her immediate vicinity, but she had not asked, and he had not said, and the not asking and the not saying had been its own kind of conversation. He carried it in himself, which required maneuvering through the back door that made Clara press her lips together to keep her face dignified, and he set it in the front room by the east window where the morning light came in best, and he straightened up and looked at it and then at her. It was simple and solid and exactly the right size. It had a wide surface for ledgers and a drawer on the right side and a small shelf above for the things you needed within reach. It was made from the same wood as the house which she suspected was deliberate. Not the same age, but the same origin, the same forest, the same hands that had built the walls around them. She walked to it, put her hand flat on the surface. It's perfect, she said. I was watching her hand on the wood. I wasn't sure about the shelf. The shelf is exactly right. She turned and looked at him. You made a desk for me. You needed one, he said. Like it was simple. Like the things that matter are always simple at their core, and it's only everything around them that gets complicated. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him and looked up at his face. This face she'd been reading for months. This face that had started as a stranger's and had become the most familiar landscape she knew, and she put her hand on his chest flat, the way she'd put it on the desk, and she said, "I love you." He was very still. She felt his heart under her hand, and she felt the exact moment it changed pace, and she thought that was the most honest thing she'd ever been near. "Clara," he said. His voice was low and careful, the way it went when something mattered beyond his ability to be measured about it. "I know it's soon," she said. "I know we haven't said it. I know there are—" "It's not soon," he said. She stopped. "I've known it for—" He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. "For longer than I had words for it. I told you I hadn't found the right word yet." He looked at her with the full, unmanaged expression of a man who has stopped protecting himself from something and found that stopping was actually a relief. "I think love is the right word." She held his gaze. "I think so too," she said. He put his hand over hers on his chest, held it there. They stood in the front room of the house he'd built, and she'd filled in the life they'd made from what someone else had thrown away. And the late November light came through the east window and landed on the desk he'd made for her, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment, because there was nothing else that needed saying. What had been broken had been brought here. What had been brought here had been made into something outside. Billy was whistling badly cheerfully, without any apparent concern for the notes, and Tom's voice rose briefly to make some observation about the whistling that Billy responded to, with the easy confidence of a young man who has received a letter that made a girl cry in the best possible way and has not yet come down from it. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses made a sound that carried the specific contentment of an animal that is warm and fed and in no danger of any kind. Clara could feel the ranch breathing around her. All of it. The acres and the fences and the new north section and the garden sleeping under the frost and the ledgers she was going to fill with careful numbers that told the true story of a good operation growing into a better one. She thought about the morning they'd loaded her onto the wagon. She thought about the sealed letter and the coins and the word burden carried on another woman's indifferent voice through a plank wall. She thought about everything they'd intended for her. She thought about where she was standing right now. The family who sent her away believed they were ending something. They were wrong. They put a woman on a wagon and pointed her at a stranger's ranch and told her to disappear, and she had arrived at that ranch and found a man who had already decided before she set foot on his land that she was going to be treated like a person. She had found 8 men who needed someone to pay attention to them. She had found a garden's worth of ground that needed planting. She had found 40 acres of land that needed someone to claim it with the right intentions. She had found a life that had been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. The Bennetts called her a burden. Wyatt built her a desk. She was done explaining the difference between those two things to anyone who couldn't see it for themselves. She was done apologizing for the space she took up. She was done shrinking. The woman they had thrown away had been caught by something solid, and she had taken root. And she was not going anywhere, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because there was nowhere else she wanted to be. She was home. She had been